Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon, Mr.
Good
Speaker.
afternoon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, just a few questions to
Proceed.
the... Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if the good chairman in lines 53 to 65 essentially talk about the rebates, and in these rebates that we are requesting the PBMs to share that information, through you, Mr. Speaker, is that information already available as we see that in the latter part of this amendment, somewhere in lines 389 and beyond? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, no, it is not publicly available.
Representative Srinivasan.
So through you, Mr. Speaker, now that this information we are requesting the PBMs to provide, will that information be available publicly? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, in an aggregated form that does not denote specifics that would lead anybody in the public to know specific companies that were offering these rebates, it will then exist in the public sphere. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
So through you, Mr. Speaker, for clarification purposes, maybe the good chair can tell us about the aggregated forms that obviously is being discussed in this amendment. Through you, Mr. Speaker, how would this aggregated form of reporting work for a PBM? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, the Commissioner would disseminate this information in a report that would say perhaps $1 billion of rebates were offered in the state in the year 2017, and that would be the aggregated form. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
So through you, Mr. Speaker, so this aggregated rebate information would the public knowledge would not include individual companies, would not include individual drugs. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that is correct.
Representative Srinivasan.
So through you, Mr. Speaker, what the public information will say is the total amount, whether it be $1 million or $1 billion or multiple billions, is the amount that the PBMs got as a rebate. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that is the first part of it. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
And through you, Mr. Speaker, the purpose of that information, with that information being available, what is it that the Commissioner will be able to accomplish? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, what it will accomplish is that there is no other state in the country right now that is making this kind of information available. And so for the purposes of us understanding one of the very most important pieces of the pipeline from a drug manufacturer to a PBM to an insurer to you at your local neighborhood pharmacy, is there's a lot of money being spent there. And the second piece of this is to determine how much of that is then coming to the PBM and how much of it is leaving the PBM to go on to you. And so we're hoping that because of the two answers there, we would be able to see what the trends are among PBMs, and therefore what the trends are in terms of how much the consumer is benefiting from the rebates being offered by the manufacturers to the PBMs. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the good chairman for making it very clear. Excuse me. I apologize, I forgot to turn the phone off. Through you, Mr. Speaker, so I want to thank the good chairman for that explanation, because that is important, that is critical for us to know in aggregate the total amount, and I'm sure that probably is in billions, the amount would be that is given to the PBM, and what percentage, what part of that aggregate is then passed on to you and me as a consumer, and what is retained by the PBM. Through you, Mr. Speaker, I definitely, that information is important, is critical, is laudable. But through you, Mr. Speaker, would it not be more important and more relevant as to if we get information that we can then dissect it out and see where the outliers are and who are within the bell curve, through you, Mr. Speaker,
Representative
rather than the aggregate.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I would tend to agree with the representative that that would be better information, but there are significant proprietary concerns that were brought to my attention as the chair of this bill about the impact that that information being public and disseminated at that level of specificity would cause on the PBM's ability to do what they do, which is to negotiate drug prices, and they believe to negotiate drug prices to the benefit of consumers if their competitors were to know what they were being offered for certain drugs or what they were offering. So I agree with the representative that that might be more helpful information, but I do believe that there is enough information here in this bill to tell us the overall trends and for us to see quite clearly what is happening here and to compel them, given the fact that there's only a handful of them that operate in this country, without risking the proprietary information that is the foundation of their business. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
So through you, Mr. Speaker, the percentage or the total amount given to the PBM and the PBM then passing it on to the consumer, that is the intent of lines 53 to 65 as an aggregate. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
That is correct. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Moving on to lines 122 to 125. What we are trying to do here is the 25 outpatient prescription drugs that experience the greatest year-to-year increase in cost. Through you, Mr. Speaker, is this as a cost in its totality, as to the amount spent on drug A or drug B, or just the increase in cost in that particular drug, whatever the 25 drugs are? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, is the increase from year to year. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
So through you, Mr. Speaker, is if I to understand it, if last year X amount of money was spent, and let's take the example of EpiPen, and that was a cost that we spent, and now with the new cost, it has become comes under the one of the 25 that come into that category. Is that what we are looking for? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, perhaps I can answer this question in a different way. The preceding section is the overall cost. The section that we're discussing right now, 122 to 125, is the percentage cost. So perhaps in the first section, 118 to 121, that would be the EpiPen that spiked at an outrageous amount. The second would be a gradual increase, and what the specific increase was, not the overall cost of it. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
So through you, Mr. Speaker, I just want to be clear. So the 25 outpatient drugs that experience the greatest year-to-year cost, these are individual drugs that we're looking at. Individual drugs is the list that we are trying to compile. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
That is correct. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, Mr. Speaker, is it the individual drugs increase, or is it the total amount spent on that class of drugs? So that's what I want to make sure, the separation between the two. Through you, Mr. Speaker, and just for clarification to the good chairman, a drug could have gone up 30%, let's say, but we didn't spend that total amount as an aggregate because there was not a need for the drug. Whereas another drug may have gone up only 10% in its increase, but we used so much of the drug, So it would come into a different group as the total amount spent on that drug. So what is it that we're looking for between these two drugs that will make that list of the top 25?
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, if I understand the question correctly, I believe what the good representative is asking me, the answer would be, it's the individual over year to year, not the totality. So it's the individual drugs, the top 25 of them, different drugs, year to year, experiencing the biggest increases. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And that is very useful because that's how you're going to be able to tell, as opposed to a total cost to the state or to anybody else, because that depends on how much it was used as opposed to the individual cost. Thank you for the clarification, Mr. Speaker. Going on to lines 359, and let me get So through you, Mr. Speaker, earlier we talked about 25 drugs, and now in lines 359 to 368, we talk about 10 drugs. And through you, Mr. Speaker, I just want to make sure that we're clear the difference between what we just talked about and lines 359 to 368.
Representative
Through you,
Scanlon.
Mr. Speaker.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that's a great question. What we were just talking about is requiring the health plans, when they file their rates, to voluntarily give us the top 25 information for their specific plan. What we're talking about here in lines 359 through 368 is the ability for the state to go to companies that had 10 of the highest, or a company that was one of the top 10, and proactively go and ask them for more information. So one is a reactive thing where we are just getting information that happened from the plans. The second is empowering the state to actually go proactively and ascertain what the reasons were for up to 10 drugs that experienced that percentage of an increase, specifically through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
And through you, Mr. Speaker, in this 10 drug analysis, we are doing in a proactive way, as the good chairman said, rather than reactive. Once again, we're looking at individual drug increase and not the aggregate of a drug used. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
That is correct. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, going to lines 389 to 395. Through you, Mr. Speaker, that's information that already exists in the public domain. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, it's in the manner in which it's reported under the 10K, and the key phrase there is consistent with the quality and types of information and data that is provided under the 10K. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
So through you, Mr. Speaker, the difference is the way in which this information now gets to the public domain. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, it's, again, the key phrase being quality and types of information, and then it references the 10K as sort of a standard form in which we could get this information, but it's not information that is in the 10K necessarily. Through you.
Representative Srinivasan.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, when I look at the OFA's analysis, which I don't think we have touched upon so far in our conversation with the good ranking member on insurance. Through you, Mr. Speaker, what is the expense A, and who's going to bear that expense? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, if the gentleman could rephrase his question, I'm not sure I understand what he's asking.
Representative Srinivasan. Try again, please.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, for us to do all of this evaluation and come up with a list of 25, come up with a list of 10, and look at the aggregates and all of that, that work to be done, through you, Mr. Speaker, obviously will need the appropriate manpower and the cost factor involved. So through you, Mr. Speaker, A, who's bearing that cost? And B, what is that cost? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Better Representative Scanlon?
Through you, Mr. Speaker, on the top 25, that's coming from the insurance carriers themselves, so that cost is not known to us or is not, an issue that we would have to worry about on the state budget side. With regard to the top 10 list, it is not a mandate. It's an option for them, whether it's the Office of Health Strategy, to go and do that work. And that agency or entity, I guess it's not an agency itself, but that entity believes that they can handle this amount of work within their available appropriations. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
So through you, Mr. Speaker, what the Office of Health Strategy, we are requesting them to do is not a mandate, but we are suggesting that they look into the top 10. And it is my understanding from the chairman to do the top 10, if they choose to do so, it will be within the available appropriations. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
That is correct. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
And through you, Mr. Speaker, my question as far as the rebates, monitoring those rebates, and going all of that evaluation, will that be borne by the insurance, the fund? Through you, Mr. Speaker, and what would be the cost to the insurance fund?
Representative Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that is also, as far as I've been told by the agency, that it would be within their available appropriations as well to compile that report annually. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
And so my final question, Mr. Speaker, is this information, which is valuable information, as a good chairman and our ranking member said, could we do more? Of course we can. But this is the right step for us to go, get that information, dissect out that information in the year to come, and then hopefully we will work on that and improve as the years go by. And it is my understanding that to get this work done, neither the insurance fund nor our state will bear any additional expense because it will be within available appropriations. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Scanlon.
That is correct. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Srinivasan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the good chairman for his answers.